She wed him for duty, then saw the human rise as a battle deity. The council chamber was already full when they brought him in, and every pair of eyes in that room turned with the same quiet disgust that I had been trained since birth to hide behind a composed face. I did not hide it well that day. His name was Cadden Holt, a human, a Terran, compact officer, rank of commander, with a service record that had been read aloud to me the night before by my senior aide, Siri, in the same tone one uses to describe a disappointing meal. 11 years of service, 3 frontier postings, 1 combination for what the Terran called outstanding tactical decision-making under pressure, which told me nothing I considered useful. He had no lineage of war, no bloodline carved into the stones of any great battle. He was by every measure my people used to judge a warrior unremarkable. He walked into that chamber in a plain gray uniform, no ceremonial armor, no trophies hanging at his belt, no ritual markings on his skin that would tell the room what he had survived and what he had conquered. He simply walked in, stood at the correct distance from the high table, and waited. My people filled that room. Generals, fleet commanders, high ministers, every one of them draped in the deep red and black of the Keldron Imperium, layered in the visual language of 6 centuries of dominance. They looked at him the way one looks at a chair someone has placed in the wrong position, not with anger, with mild dismissive correction already forming in their minds. My aunt, Admiral Velura, sat at the head of the high table. She had commanded the Keldron Third Fleet through 2 full campaigns and had not lost a single engagement in 40 years of service. She looked at Cadden Holt the way she looked at problems she had already solved. You understand the terms? She said. It was not a question. I do, he said. His voice was steady, not loud, not commanding, just completely, unnervingly steady. The Union is political, she continued. It secures the border agreement between the Imperium and the Terran Compact. My niece, Velshari, will serve as ambassador to the neutral station of Catharin. You will accompany her as her consort. You will perform your ceremonial role, and you will not interfere with Kelran diplomatic operations. A pause. You are a symbol, she said. Nothing more. I watched him. I watched for the flinch, the tightening of the jaw, the flicker of pride that gets wounded when a man is told precisely what he is worth. I have seen that reaction 100 times in 100 different species. It is one of the few things all thinking creatures seem to share. He did not flinch. He looked at my aunt with those calm, dark eyes and said, I have been called worse. The room was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then Minister Velha, seated to my aunt's left, made a small sound. That might have been a laugh. My aunt's expression did not change. She moved on to the administrative details of the arrangement as if he had said nothing at all. I kept looking at him for a moment, longer than I should have. I told myself I was assessing a potential liability. That is what I told myself. The ceremony took place 3 days later. It was short by Keldron standards. We reserved the long ceremonies for unions of genuine significance, a brief recitation of the diplomatic clauses in exchange of binding tokens, my hand in his for approximately 4 seconds while the high recorder marked the time. His hand was warm. I noticed that, and then immediately decided that it was not worth noticing. My father was not present. He was on the front lines of The outer reach, which is where he always was, which is where every Keldron of any worth spent their time. My mother was present and did not look a Cadden halt at all, which was a particular kind of insult that only Keldron mothers know how to deliver. My younger sister, Velmira, stared at him with open curiosity the entire time, which embarrassed me in a way I had not expected. After the ceremony, Siri handed me a data slate with our transport scheduled to Catherine and said, very quietly, he did not look afraid. My lady, why would he be afraid? I asked. Siri paused with a careful hesitation of a person choosing their words like they are stepping across uncertain ground. Because of where he is going, she said, because of what he is agreeing to. I understood what she meant. Kiran was a neutral station, but it was deep in the boundary zone between Kelron space and the outer territories. It was not a comfortable assignment. It was a posting that required a certain kind of person, someone who did not mind being far from safety, far from reinforcement, far from anything that could be called a quick exit. He is a soldier, I said. Soldiers go where they are sent. Siri said nothing. She had worked with me for 9 years and had learned the exact locations of the conversations. I did not want to continue. Kian was smaller than I had expected and busier than the reports had suggested. It served as a waypoint for 6 different trade routes and a refueling stop for ships that could not make the long crossing to the inner systems. Without a rest, the population was mixed. Keldron administrators, Terran traders, 3 or 4 other species that existed in the spaces between the great powers, surviving on adaptability and careful neutrality. Our quarters were functional, adequate. I had been given the larger office, which was proper. Cadden was given the room adjacent to mine, which was also proper, and which I expected him to complain about at some point because it was smaller and had only 1 window. He did not complain. He unpacked in approximately 20 minutes, appeared in the common area of our shared residence with a data reader in one hand, asked me if I had any preference regarding the temperature of the common room, and when I said I did not, he set it to something reasonable and sat down and read. I watched him for a moment from across the room. Do you not have a settling in process? I asked. He looked up. I settled in it quickly. I've lived in worse places than this, he said. Kiran has hot water, functioning gravity, and a kitchen. I've posted in places that had none of those 3 things. He looked back at his reader. It's fine. I had no answer for that, so I went to my office and began reviewing the diplomatic correspondence that had accumulated during transit. There was a great deal of it. I worked until the station's artificial night cycle dimmed the corridor lights, and when I emerged to get water, the common room was empty, and Cadden's door was closed. On the floor outside my office door was a plate. It held something warm, covered in a simple cloth to preserve the heat. I lifted the cloth. It was a tan meal, something with grain and slow-cooked protein in a dark sauce that smelled of something I did not have a name for. There was no note. There did not need to be one. The only other person on this station who had access to our residence was Cadden Hall. I stood there holding the cloth for a long moment, then I ate it, because I had not eaten since morning, and the alternative was going back to my desk and pretending I was not hungry. It was very good. I was not going to tell him that. I went to bed and lay in the Dark and listened to the quiet hum of the station around me and thought about the way he had looked at my aunt when she told him what he was, not afraid, not angry, not wounded, just steady. I did not know then what steadiness like. That cost a person. I did not know what it was built from or how long it had taken him to build it or what kind of life had served as the raw material. I would find out, not that night, not in the ways I expected, but I would find outside, beyond the station's hull. The stars were cold and far away and completely indifferent to the small, strange arrangement that had just begun. In their vicinity, inside, I was already paying more attention than I had planned to when the station turned through the dark and Cat and Holt slept in the room next to mine, and somewhere in the outer territories, the thing that would eventually change everything was already moving toward us, patient and vast, and completely unaware that it had made a critical error. It had not accounted for him. None of us had. The first morning on Kedon, I woke at the 4th station hour and could not go back to sleep. This was not unusual. I am a light sleeper by nature, and a lighter one by training. A Keldron officer learns early that sleep is a resource to be managed, not enjoyed. I rose, dressed, reviewed the overnight diplomatic feeds, and was in the middle of drafting a response to a trade clause dispute when I heard movement in the corridor. I checked the time, 4th hour, 40 minutes, still fully dark in the station's artificial cycle. I heard the exterior door of our residence open, then close. I told myself it was not my concern. He was free to move about the station as he chose. My responsibility was the diplomatic mission, not the supervision of a grown man's sleep schedule. I went back to my drafting. 11 minutes later, I found myself at the window that faced the interior of the station's main gravity ring, a long curved corridor that ran the circumference of Ketharin's middle section, used primarily for cargo transit and apparently for one Terran officer who had decided to run it at the 5th hour of the morning. He was not jogging, he was running. There is a difference that I know from a life of physical training. Jogging is maintenance, running is pursuit. It has a different quality of effort, a different angle of lean, a different relationship between the runner and the ground. He ran like he was chasing something, or like something was worth reaching. His form was clean and efficient in the way that only comes from years of repetition. He was not showing off. There was no one to show off for. He simply ran. I watched for longer than I needed to establish the fact of it. Then I went back to my drafting. He was back in the residence. Before the 6th hour, I heard him in the kitchen. The smell of something brewing reached under my office door. Terran morning drink, dark and slightly bitter, that I had encountered once before at a diplomatic reception, and had not disliked as much as I had expected. 40 minutes later, he knocked on my office door frame. I had left the door open. He stood in the opening with 2 cups in his hands and said, "Do you drink coffee?" I looked at the cups. "I have had it once. Did you like it?" I considered the honest answer. It was tolerable. He set 1 cup on the corner of my desk without any particular ceremony and said, "I'm heading to the diplomatic wing to review the station's communication protocols. Is there anything you need from that side?" I had not asked him to do that. I had not thought to ask him to do that. Communication protocols were relevant to Our mission and reviewing them was exactly the kind of preparatory work that a competent aide would do without being told, except that he was not my aide, he was technically my consort, which by Keldron standards meant he had no official function beyond his symbolic presence. The encryption logs for the past 60 days, I said, adjusting quickly. If they are accessible, I'll get them. He said and left. I looked at the cup on my desk. I picked it up. The coffee was strong and slightly too hot and tasted like the decision to face something difficult. I drank half of it before I realized I had stopped reading the document in front of me. Over the next 2 weeks, I began to compile, without fully intending to, a mental record of things Cadden Holt did that I had not expected. He ran every morning, without exception, 15 km by my calculation, given the length of the gravity ring and the number of circuits. Siri reported seeing him complete on the morning she came in early, once when there was a minor hole seal issue that required the gravity ring to be closed. For 6 hours, he ran in place in his room. For 90 minutes, I know this because the vibration registered on the residence's internal sensors, which I checked for maintenance purposes, or so I told Siri. He read everything, I mean this with genuine precision, everything. He worked through the Keldron Cultural Archive that was available on the station's public database. He read the complete tactical history of every recorded VTHK engagement in the outer reach. He read the trade law documents relevant to our diplomatic mission, which were extensive and deeply tedious, and he did this while also reading the personal journals of 3 different Keldron admirals that someone had donated to the station's historical collection. I found one of the journals on the common room table one evening, open to a passage where Admiral Veldreth wrote about his decision at the Battle of the Second Corridor. I picked it up. The page had faint marks where someone had traced lines with a dry finger, the habit of a person following text they wanted to remember. I put it back exactly as I had found it. He had conversations with everyone on the station, not in the chatty social way that some people felt. Silence with words. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions. He had a long conversation with Kieran's head engineer, a quiet Terran woman named Nora Bain, about the station's reactor cycling schedule. He spent an afternoon with the Keldron supply officer, a veteran named Gret, who had 40 years of border posting experience, and who I had expected to be the last person on the station to give a human the time of day. I was wrong about that. I saw them in the corridor 3 days after we arrived. Gret was talking, actually talking, not performing the cold tolerance that most of my people offered to the human population of the station. And Cadden was listening with his full attention in the way he always listened. Like what you were saying was the most important thing in the room. When Gree noticed me, he straightened and gave the proper formal acknowledgement, but after I passed, I heard him continue the story he had been telling. I asked Siri about it later, casually, the way one asks about things they are not particularly interested in. The commander asked Gret about the Outer Reach campaign. Siri said about the defensive positions they Keldron used in the early years of the VTHK pressure. Gree said no one had ever asked him to explain the tactical logic behind the third position doctrine. Before, he seemed very pleased. Of course he had asked. Of course the sparring incident happened at the end of The third week, Kiran had a small training facility, modest by Kelrin standards, adequate by any other. Gret used it daily, and a handful of the Keldrin officers stationed on the administrative side used it in the evenings. I used it 3 times a week. Early morning, before the diplomatic schedule started, this was my private time and I guarded it. I was finishing a training session when Cadden arrived. He looked at the space, looked at Gree, who was wrapping his hands at the edge of the mat, and said, "May I?" Gret looked at him with the expression my people use when they are about to demonstrate something. "You want to spar?" he said. "If you're willing." Gret smiled. It was not a kind smile. "I am always willing." What happened next was something I watched from the doorway, and I am going to describe it carefully because it is important and because it is the first time I understood, not suspected, not noted, but genuinely understood what kind of person Cadden Holt was. Gree hit him hard. The first exchange lasted about 12 seconds and ended with Cadden on the mat. He got up. Gret hit him hard again, a combination that most opponents would have spent valuable time predicting and failed. Gree was very good, 40 years of genuine experience, the kind of fighter who had refined his approach through real encounters rather than practice bouts. Cadden went down again. He got up again. This continued. I stopped counting at 5 times down, but here is what I watched with my full attention. Every time he got up, something had changed. Not dramatically, not the sudden second wind that stories describe, not the heroic recovery that training instructors use as examples. Something quieter. Each time he rose, he had adjusted, his guard shifted, his footwork changed. He was reading breath in real time, absorbing information the way a dry surface absorbs water, and each fall was in some fundamental way lesson he was applying. By the time 14 exchanges had passed, Gree had not knocked him down in 8 of them. By the 22nd exchange, Gree was working noticeably harder. They stopped when Gree called time. Both of them were breathing hard. Gree looked at Cadden with an expression I had never seen on his face in the 9 months I had been his commanding officer's representative. Respect exactly, not yet, but the precursor to it, the moment before. Respect when a person recalculates you. Fall well, Gree said. I've had practice. Cadden said. Who taught you to read? Fighter experience. Cadden said. Mostly being hit. Gret made a sound that was, I believe, the closest he came to a laugh. He offered Cadden water, accepted it. Talked for a while in the easy way that people talk after they have tested each other and found the test worthwhile. I left before either of them noticed me watching. That evening I was reviewing navigational data for our sector when Cadden knocked on my office door again. He had a data slate in one hand and the look of someone who has found something they want to show you, the VTH Chi movement pattern from the last 6 months. He said, "Can I show you something?" I gestured at the chair across from my desk. He sat and turned the slate toward me. He had mapped the VTH Chi incursion reports from the past season against the trade route data for our sector of the boundary zone. The overlay produced a pattern that was not immediately obvious, but was, once he traced the key points with one finger, absolutely clear. They are not random, he said. Look at the clustering. They hit energy-rich positions in groups of 3, always with the weakest approach vector last. The third incursion in each cluster is the real one. The first two are pressure tests. I looked at the map. I looked at the data. He was right. It was so plainly right that I felt a small cold feeling at the back of my thoughts. Feeling you get when you realize something important has been sitting in plain view and you have been looking. Slightly to the side of it, the Keldron Border Command has not identified this. I said no, he said, their reports treat each incursion as a separate event. Why have you been studying this? He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable. He was almost never uncomfortable. Just giving the question the same weight he gave everything. Because we are on Chiron, he said, and Chiron is an energy-rich position, and 3 months ago there were 2 VTHK probing incidents in adjacent sectors. I felt that cold feeling again stronger. This time you think we are a target, I said. I think we should be prepared as if we are. He said there is a difference. I looked at him across the desk. The station lights were on their evening setting, slightly warmer and lower than the working cycle, and in that light he looked less like the unremarkable man who had walked into the council chamber, and more like something I did not quite have a word for. The word would come to me later. It would take a crisis to unlock it. Send your analysis to my secure file, I said. I will review the full data tonight. He nodded past the slate across and stood to leave. At the door he paused. The coffee, he said. I had finished the whole cup. I had not told him this. It was tolerable, I said. He left. I heard the quiet sound of his door a few minutes later. I opened his analysis file and began to read. I did not stop reading for 3 hours. Outside, the boundary zone was dark and patient, and somewhere in the outer territories, the thing that would change everything was moving exactly as Cadden had predicted in its careful and terrible pattern of threes. The first 2 had already happened. We were the third. The alert came at the second hour, 2 weeks after. Cadence showed me the map. I was awake. I am always awake when things begin. Not because I predicted it, but because the body knows before the mind does, and I had gone to bed that night with a tension in my shoulders that would not release, the same tension I had felt before every engagement I had ever survived. My armor was on before the second klaxon cycle finished. I was moving down the corridor toward the armory before Siri's voice reached me on the comm with the details I already knew. In my bones, VTHK multiple breach points. The station's outer defense grid had caught the leading edge of the first wave 22 seconds ago. Estimated time to hull contact was 9 minutes. The armory was 2 levels below the diplomatic wing. I took the emergency stairs because the transit pods would be flooded with station personnel. I passed 3 Keldron guards who were moving in the opposite direction toward the civilian shelters where they were supposed to direct non-combat personnel. I passed a Terran trader who had pressed herself flat against the wall, with her eyes wide and her breathing fast. I passed Siri, who had somehow gotten into partial armor and was moving with me without my having to tell her. 2. The tactical center was on the same level as the armory in the fortified core of the station. When I pushed through the blast door, I expected to find it in the controlled chaos that always marks the first minutes of an engagement. Officers shouting data incomplete, someone senior trying to establish authority over a room that hasn't decided who is in charge yet. The room was not in chaos. Cadden was already there. He was standing at the central Command table with 3 display screens. Active in front of him, and he was already working. His uniform jacket was off, his comm was live, and he was speaking in a low, rapid voice to the station's defense grid operator, a young Kelran officer named Velson, who had been on his first border posting for exactly 4 months and who was at that moment listening to Cadden with the focused desperation of a person who has found in an unexpected place someone who knows what to do. They are coming in. Layered pulses, Cadence said, not looking up from the screens. 3 wave front staggered by approximately 90 seconds between each one. The first wave is a screen. It is meant to draw our forward defense elements forward and burn them before the second wave hits. The gap they create, we do not take that bait. Felson opened his mouth. Commander, the forward grid is already cycling to engage. Pull it back, Cadence said. It was not a shout. It was not a command in the Keldran tradition of volume and force. It was a statement delivered with such complete certainty that it had the weight of something already decided. Pull the forward grid back 30 seconds. If I am wrong, you can send it forward again, and I will take full responsibility for the delay. If I am right, you will have your gap fill solution in position before the second wave arrives. Velen looked at me. I had just entered the room. I was his ranking Keldran officer, and he needed my authorization. I looked at Cadden. I looked at the map on his screens. I saw the pattern he had shown me 2 weeks ago made real, rendered in the live data of an actual attack, and I saw that he had been right then, which meant he was most likely right now, which meant I had approximately 4 seconds to make a decision that would affect every life on this station. Pull the forward grid back, I said. Executed, Commander Holtz. Instructions. The room moved. Velson relayed the order. 2 other officers who had been watching from behind their stations began moving to support positions. Nora Bain, the head engineer, appeared from the secondary entrance and went directly to the power management console without being asked. Cadden looked up from the screens for the first time since I had entered. He looked at me for 1 second, 1 full clear second of acknowledgement, and then looked back at the screens. Velshari, he said, using my full name the way he always did. The second and third internal corridors are the most likely hull breach points if the second wave gets through. Can you take them? I had my armor, I had my weapons, I had Siri at my shoulder and 3 Keldran guards who had followed me in and were waiting for direction. Yes, I said, I need you to hold them for 12 minutes, he said. Not longer. 12 minutes in the second wave will be dealt with. After that, the third wave is the real problem, and we handle it differently. 12 minutes against a Vetkai breach force in a confined corridor with 5 fighters. Fine, I said, and went. What happened in those corridors is mine to carry and not the point of this telling. I will say this: 12 minutes in a narrow passage with VTH Kai breach units pressing the line is a very long time. The VTH Kai do not fight the way other species fight. They do not have the concept of individual sacrifice in the same way. Each unit is a part, a larger distributed mind, and they advance in the knowledge that losing individual elements is simply a calculation, not a cost. This makes them terrifying in a specific way. That experience helps you manage, and inexperience does not. I had experience. Siri had experience. The 3 guards were young, but they followed well, and they did not break at the 11-minute mark. The pressure on our position dropped suddenly and sharply, not because we had defeated the breach force, because the second wave above us had been met. I heard it through the hull, through the station itself. Series of concussions that told me something large had happened in the right direction. At 13 minutes, Velson's voice came over my comm. Second wave destroyed 68% of the VTHK force. Neutralized. Commander Holt is repositioning for the third wave. I held my corridor for 4 more minutes while the repositioning completed. Then the pressure stopped. The VTHK breach units ahead of us went still, not dead, not retreating, but paused. The way creature pauses when its direction from the central mind is suddenly interrupted. It lasted 18 seconds. Then they began to withdraw above us. The third wave had arrived exactly where Caden said it would, and he had placed Nora Baines' plasma vent configuration, which he had discussed with her 3 days earlier under the guise of understanding the station's emergency systems directly in its path. The third wave did not reach the hull. I came back to the tactical center 90 minutes after the alert had begun. The fighting was over. The VTHK force was destroyed or dispersed. The station had 11 dead and 23 wounded. The damage to the outer hull was significant but repayable. The defense grid had performed beyond its rated parameters because Caden had rewritten its engagement sequencing on the fly. During the 12 minutes I had been in the corridor, he was at the command table. His screen showed the current damage assessment. He was already directing the repair prioritization. Gret was standing near the door when I entered. He had been part of the internal defense force, one of the older guards who had fought in real engagements before this posting. He looked at me with an expression that was not complicated and was not easy. Your husband, he said, keeping his voice low. What is he? I looked across the room at Caden Hall, who was telling Nora Bain which sections of the plasma venting system needed to be repaired first and why, and who had dried blood on the sleeve of his uniform from somewhere in the fighting that I had not seen, but that he had clearly not escaped entirely, and who was doing all of this with the same steady, quiet, complete focus that he brought to morning runs and archived journals and cups of coffee left outside office doors. I'm not sure, I said, but I am starting to understand. Graith made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite argument. He left. I stood at the door for a moment longer. Then I crossed the room and took a position at the secondary screen beside Caden. Because the repair prioritization was complex and the diplomatic implications of the station's damage status needed to be managed alongside the technical work. And because, and this is the part I did not examine closely in that moment, I did not want to be on the other side of the room. He noticed. He made space at the table without comment. We worked through the night side by side in the quiet of a station that had survived as the lights came up on the next day's cycle. Outside the stars were still cold. They were always cold, but something had shifted in the space between them and us, and I was beginning to understand that the shift had been happening for much longer than one night. 4 days after the attack, the message came from the Keldron High Command. It arrived on the diplomatic channel, which meant it came to me first, and I read it alone in my office in the early morning with cold coffee. beside my screen and the kind of carefully arranged calm that I have learned to put on my face before I let myself feel the full weight of what I am reading. The High Command wanted to commend the defense of Cathoran. They also wanted to discuss the performance and assessment of attached Terran Officer Caden Halt and his potential deployment to what they called an expanded operational role in the Boundary Zone Theater. There was language about interspecies cooperation and the value of joint tactical frameworks. It was very well written. It was also underneath the diplomatic surface completely clear about what it meant. They wanted to use him. They wanted to point him at the worst part of the VTHK front and see what he could do there, because the story of Cathoran had traveled the way stories of that kind always travel faster than official reports through the networks that soldiers use through the accounts of people who had been in that tactical center and had watched a human rewrite battle in real time with nothing but preparation, pattern recognition, and a complete refusal to react from fear. They wanted to use him, and they expected him to go because he was an asset, and assets are deployed. What they had not considered what the High Command in its 600 years of confident dominance had perhaps never fully learned to account for is that sometimes assets have people attached to them, people who have been paying attention. I told Caden about the communication at the kitchen table that morning over the coffee that had somewhere in the last 3 months stopped being tolerable and started being something I looked forward to. I told him plainly, the way I tell everything without softening the edges. I told him they would frame it as an honor. I told him the VTHK front, the outer sectors, was the most contested region in the boundary zone, and that 3 Keldron admirals had rotated through command positions there in the past 2 years, none of them surviving their second campaign season. I told him the posting was functionally a place the High Command sent problems to be solved or expended, and that from their perspective he was both. He listened to all of it. He held his coffee cup in both hands the way he always did when he was thinking, and he looked at the table, and he was quiet for long enough that I had time to notice how the station's morning light came through the window at an angle that made the room look warmer than it was. Then he said, "You are telling me this because you think I should not go. I am telling you this because you deserve to know what you are agreeing to." I said, "There is a difference." He looked up from the table. His eyes were steady in the way they were always steady, but there was something in them that morning that was not quite the same as before, something open like a door that has been closed for a long time and has just been moved slightly by someone standing on the other side. "Velshari," he said, "I've known since the ceremony that I was a symbol. I knew it going in. The High Council decided I was decorative, and I made my peace with that before I ever walked into that chamber." He paused, but the question was always going to be whether I could be something more than what they decided, whether I could make the assignment mean something real. "You have already done that," I said, and I heard the plainness in my own voice and did not try to soften it. "Kiran is one station," he said. "It is 340 people. The front is—" He stopped. "The front is a different number." He set down his cup. He looked at me with that open expression, the one I was still learning to read. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not diplomatically." "I'm always honest," I said. It is one of my more inconvenient qualities. Something moved in his face. That was almost a smile, but had too much weight behind it to become one fully. If it were you, he said, if you had the option to stay in a safe posting or go to the place where you were most needed, and risk was real, what would you do? I thought about my father, who was always on the front line. I thought about the Keldron code of conduct that I had memorized before I could read fluently. I thought about 11 dead crew members and 23 wounded, and the look on Velson's face when he had realized the battle was won. I thought about what it means to be the person in the room who knows what to do. I would go, I said. He nodded. Then you know why I have to? I knew. I had known before I asked. I had told myself I was giving him information so he could make a free choice, but there is a version of honesty that is also a kind of cowardice, and sitting at that table, the morning light, I was close enough to it to feel its edges. I was afraid for him. I did not have a comfortable relationship with that fear, because fear for another person is a vulnerability my training does not have a good framework for, so I did what I do with things I cannot immediately process. I set it aside with the intention of returning to it, and I said, then we should begin preparing your operation briefing. If they are deploying you to the front, I intend to be satisfied that your preparation is thorough before you leave. He looked at me for a moment. He said, your briefing. I corrected. He did not push the correction, but he also did not accept it, and I could see in the particular quality of his steadiness that he had heard both versions of what I had said and had filed them both away. In the week that followed, the story of Kethen continued to travel. Siri told me about it in pieces, bringing it to me with the careful timing she used when she had information she suspected I needed and was uncertain how I would receive it. The accounts were spreading through the Keldron border stations. First, the tactical centers, the communications relays, the informal networks of soldiers who share stories, the way they share equipment freely, and with the additions that make a true story feel more complete. The core of it was accurate. A human had held Catherine against a VTH Chi attack that should have been beyond the station's capacity to survive. He had done it with preparation, not with force. He had read the attack before it arrived and positioned the station's assets like a player who has memorized the board. The part that spread most effectively was the detail about the forward grid. The fact that he had told the room to pull back when everything in Keldron training says you push forward, and had been right, and had taken the risk of being wrong on himself. That particular detail traveled with the kind of weight that attaches to things which reveal something true about a person's character. You cannot fake that kind of commitment to your own judgment. The room had felt it. Velson had felt it. Gree had felt it. The Keldron do not give titles lightly. We believe that a name should reflect what a person has actually done, not what we want them to do or what we hope they might become. The titles that matter are not given by councils or commanders. They emerge from the soldiers who were present, who saw the thing happen, and who decide among themselves what it was. Siri brought me a written message from a Keldron relay post in the 9th sector, forwarded through 3 hands before it reached her. It was a brief message, 2 sentences, and it referred to Cadden Holt by a name that was not his rank and was not his given name. It called him a Vorkith, the one the void did not break. I read the message twice. I set it down. Carefully on my desk, I looked at it for a while. Then I went to find Cadden, who was in the training room, and I stood in the doorway and watched him work through a solo form that I did not recognize from any Keldron tradition, something from Earth, precise and demanding, focused on balance and the management of force. He moved through it with complete concentration, and I thought about the 2 sentences in that message, and I thought about 47 systems and 600 years. And I thought about what it meant that my people who do not give anything easily had already started giving him something. He finished the form and noticed me. He lowered his hands and waited. They have given you a name, I said. He looked at me with a question in his expression. Avo, I said. It means the one. The void did not break. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, who gave it? The soldiers, I said. Ones who were here and the ones who heard. He looked away for a moment, toward the window, toward the dark. I could not read his expression fully, but there was something in it that I had not seen before, something that sat between being moved and being private about being moved, the way a person looks when something matters more than they intended to let it. I'm not sure I deserve it, he said. You do not choose what names are given, I said, only whether you are worthy of them. That question is still being answered. He looked back at me. And what do you think? I did not answer immediately. I stood in the doorway of the training room on a station that was still showing the marks of a battle we had survived, partly because of his preparation, and I looked at the man who had shown me a map 3 weeks before an attack and had been right about every point on it, and I said the thing I had been approaching for weeks without finding the right moment. I think I said that the most dangerous thing about you is that you do not seem to understand what you are. He looked at me for a long time after that. The station was quiet around us. Somewhere above in the diplomatic wing, there was a message from the High Command asking for a response to their deployment proposal. We had not yet responded. I was not yet ready to let the answer be simple. We shipped out on the Keldron carriers, reached 17 days after the High Command's order arrived. And I say we because by that point the question of whether I was going had stopped being a question I was examining and had become simply a fact I was acting on. No one ordered me to the front. My diplomatic assignment was Kion. The High Command's communication had requested Cadence specifically and had included as a formal courtesy an acknowledgement of my presence at the station that was so precisely worded to imply my remaining there that it might as well have been a direct instruction. I understood the message. I filed it in the same place I file messages from people who underestimate me, which is a place I return to when I need motivation. And I arranged my transfer with the kind of quiet efficiency that makes people think a decision happened naturally rather than being made with full awareness of its weight. Siri came with me. She tadpacked before I told her we were going, which is why she has been my aide for 9 years. The Veldra's Reach was a combat carrier, not a diplomatic vessel, and the difference was immediate and physical. Everything on a combat carrier is built for function and hardness. The gravity was slightly higher than station standard, which is standard on Keldron military ships, because it builds physical endurance in long-posted crews. The corridors were narrow and the lighting was strong and the air smelled of machinery, and the specific cleanliness of a vessel that is maintained with the knowledge that its systems cannot fail. Cadden adapted. Immediately, he always adapted. Immediately, by the second day of transit, he had introduced himself to the ship's navigation officer, a Keldran woman named Valera, who had been on frontline postings for 6 years and who regarded humans with a professional neutrality of someone who has learned not to bother with opinions about things outside their control. By the 4th day, Valera had invited him to a tactical review session that she ran for junior officers every 3rd evening. By the 6th day, 3 senior officers had attended the session as observers, officially to review the junior officers' progress, and unofficially, I am confident because the word about Catherine had preceded us and people wanted to see what he was. I attended one session. I sat at the back. I did not intend to stay longer than 20 minutes. I stayed for 2 hours. He did not lecture. That was the first thing I noticed. He asked questions. He laid out tactical scenarios drawn I recognized from real engagements in the VTHK archive and asked the officers in the room what they would do, and then he listened to the answers with the same complete attention he brought to everything. Clears throat, and then he asked a follow-up question that was never about whether the answer was wrong, but about what the answer was built on. Why that choice, he would ask, not whether it is right or wrong. Why, what assumption is underneath it. The junior officers were uncomfortable with this at first. Keldran military doctrine is built on clarity of command and decisive action. We do not spend a great deal of time examining the premises of our decisions in real time. We train the decisions so thoroughly that they become reflexive, because in battle the pause to think is often the pause that ends you. This is sound doctrine for most situations. Cadden knew this and said so directly. In a firefight you act on training. He said, I am not talking about firefights. I am talking about the 10 minutes before the firefight, when you still have time to ask whether your training was built for this specific situation or for the general one. Most battles are not decided in the moment. They are decided in the preparation. Valera asked him at the end of one session why he seemed to assume that every situation was slightly different from the training scenario. Because every enemy is slightly different from the training scenario, he said. The VTHK are not running the same attack they ran 6 months ago. They adapt. They have been adapting for 400 years. Question is not whether our doctrine is good. It is excellent. The question is how far we are behind the current version of the thing we are trying to fight. The room was quiet. How far behind are we? Valera asked. I don't know yet, he said. I have been trying to find out since I read the last 3 years of engagement reports. I have some ideas. I would like to test them. He tested them at the border engagement 4 days after we arrived at the front. Front was not a line, which is how my people sometimes describe it for ease of communication. It was a zone, a shifting, dynamic region where the VTHK presence was highest and the Keldran defensive posture was most active. The zone extended across several hundred km of contested space, and within it, engagements happened on a scale from skirmish to full fleet action, depending on what the Vekkai chose to concentrate. What they chose to concentrate 4 days after our arrival was a mid-scale force against a Keldran supply relay in the southern sector of the zone. The relay was lightly defended. By design, it was considered a secondary target not worth the resources of a heavy defense contingent. The VTHK knew this because they had spent 3 months probing the defensive posture of every point in the zone by a pattern of what was defended and what was not. This is exactly what Cadden had told the carrier's senior staff would happen in exactly the tactical review he had run 2 days after our arrival, and he had said it not as a prediction but as a statement of the current situation, like telling someone it will rain when the clouds are already dark. The relay's defense commander, a veteran officer named Colonel Edric Vane, had received Cadden's assessment and had the authority to request additional assets. He had not used it because the assessment had come through unofficial channels and he had not had a reason to weight it heavily. He used it when the VTHK force appeared. On the long-range sensors, Cadden was in the carrier's tactical center by the time the distress relay reached us. He had positioned himself there in the morning, which I had noticed and which Vila had also noticed. The silent communication between us on the subject of why he was there had been brief and did not require words. The engagement that followed lasted 6 hours. It was not a single battle. It was 3 overlapping crises in 3 different sectors of the zone, which is the VTHK's preferred method of stretching a defensive posture to its breaking point. They attacked the relay, drew the defensive response, then hit 2 secondary positions that the defense had deprioritized to reinforce the relay. Cadden managed all 3 simultaneously from the carrier's tactical center, coordinating with Vila on navigation adjustments and with the defense commanders on the ground and in the outlying ships through a relay chain that he had set up the day before in a way that everyone on the carrier had assumed was a precautionary measure, and that turned out to be the architecture of the response. He did not sleep. He did not eat during the 6 hours. He moved between 3 screens with the kind of focused economy that I recognized from Catherine. Nothing wasted, every movement purposeful, every word on the comm precise and clear, and without the sharp edges of panic or the heavy edges of forced authority. He was simply the clearest person in the room at every moment, and the room organized itself around that clarity the way water organizes itself around the lowest point. I was at the secondary command position, managing the diplomatic and command communication with the Keldron fleet elements involved, which kept me in the same room. This was the practical reason I was there. There was also a less practical reason which I was not examining at that time, because there was a battle happening. The relay survived. Both secondary positions held. The VTHK force withdrew in the pattern Cadden had described, not a defeat exactly, but a calculation. The cost of continuing had exceeded the anticipated return, and the central mind had adjusted. He had made the cost high enough in the right way that the calculation had changed. Colonel Vane sent a communication to the carrier after the engagement. It was addressed to Cadden personally, which was unusual. Keldron officers of that rank do not typically send personal communications to Terran commanders. The message was brief. It said, "I will not make the same error again. I would appreciate a briefing on the current state of the VTHK approach pattern at your earliest availability." Cadden showed me the Message, I read it and handed the slate back. A Keldron colonel asking a human for a briefing. I said it is a reasonable request. He said, it is more than that, I said, and he looked at me in the way he sometimes did when he was deciding whether to press a conversation forward, and I said before he could decide, you should know that the name has spread further. Veller told me this morning. The soldiers in the zone are using it. He was quiet. Avoid and something else. He waited. They are also saying Avo. I said it is older language. It means the war marked. He said I know a little of the old tongue. I looked at him. It also means the one who carries the battle forward. I said it is used in the oldest texts for commanders who do not fight for territory or advantage, who fight because the battle itself is the reason. He was still for a long time. We were in the carrier's small observation bay, which looked out on the zone's edge where the stars were fewer, and the dark between them was the kind of dark that has weight to it. I fight because people need it, he said, not because I like it. I know, I said, that is what the name means. I looked out at the dark. I had been carrying something since the morning he had told me he had to go to the front, and it had been getting heavier, and I was about to put it down. I'm afraid for you, I said. It was the plainest sentence I had ever said to another person, and the most difficult. I want you to know that, because I have been treating my own fear as a private matter, and that is a kind of dishonesty that I do not practice in other areas. He did not say anything. Immediately, I was grateful for that. I do not need to be immediately answered. I need to be heard, and the quality of his silence told me I was being heard completely. I'm afraid too sometimes, he said, not of the battles of not being enough for the ones who are counting on me. I turned to look at him. You are enough, I said. I have been watching you since the council chamber, and I am telling you as plainly as I know how, you are enough. He looked at me in the observation bay with the stars at his back, and something moved in his expression that was the same thing I had seen in the training room when I told him about the name, that private, weighted quality, the look of something mattering more than expected. That means something, he said. Coming from you, I know, I said. I'm not careless with it. Outside, the zone was active with the movement of ships, the signals of a front line that never fully slept. VTHK were out there in the dark, adapting, learning, pressing the way they had been doing for 400 years. Keldron were holding the way they had been doing for 600 years, and somewhere between those two ancient facts, a man from a species that had held its systems for 11 years was beginning to change the shape of the engagement in ways that none of the histories had predicted. I had married him for duty. I had stood beside him in a council chamber and felt nothing but the clean, efficient management of political obligation. I had assigned him a room in our shared residence and expected him to orbit my life at a safe and decorative distance. He had not done any of that. He had instead simply been what he was, completely, consistently, without performance and without apology, until what he was had become impossible to ignore, and then impossible to dismiss, and then impossible to imagine being without. I was not ready to say all of that, not yet, but I was done pretending. It was not true. The stars burned in the dark outside, cold and far and permanent, and Cadden stood beside me, looking at them, and the front line moved around us like a tide, and Tomorrow there would be more work and more decisions and more battles to prepare for. Tonight we stood at the window together and watched the dark, and neither of us needed to say anything further for the moment to mean exactly what it meant. The VTH Kai Mothermind was not a thing the Keldrin discussed openly. In official documentation it was referred to as the primary distributed intelligence, which is the High Command's way of naming something they have decided not to fight in the conversations that soldiers have when they think no one official is listening. It was called the Old Dark, which is a name that tells you everything about how the people who face it feel about the prospect of engaging it. In 400 years of Keldrin presence in the boundary zone, 3 full fleet actions had been directed against it. All 3 had been withdrawn, not defeated, not destroyed, not rooted in the traditional sense, simply determined to be unsustainable engagements, which is the military way of saying the cost of continuing was not a cost anyone was willing to pay. The Mothermind was ancient. No one knew how old. The Vekki do not have historians in any sense that translates, and the distributed intelligence does not leave records in forms that outside species can interpret. It was spread across a debris field in the deep zone that had been accumulating for longer than the Keldrin Imperium had existed, a region of space that served as both its body and its mind. It processed information in parallel across thousands of distributed nodes, which meant that attacking any single part of it was like trying to stop a river by blocking one channel. The water found another way, and the blockage itself became information that the river used to adapt. It was the reason the VTH Kai were not simply border problem. It was the reason they engagements never stopped. Every skirmish, every probe, every attack across the 400-year history of the conflict was data flowing back to the Mothermind, and the Mothermind used data the way other things use food to grow, to adapt, to become more capable of doing what it did. Cadden asked to see the full archive on the Mothermind on his 3rd day at the front. The front intelligence officer, a senior Keldrin analyst named Veeler, told him the archive was classified at a level above his access. Cadden looked at her and asked her what the access threshold was and what purpose it served, given that the information was 400 years old and the thing it described was still exactly where it had always been and still doing exactly what it had always done. Veeler looked at him for a long moment and then approved his access. She told me about it later with the slightly surprised expression of someone who had intended to say no and had found in the middle of their refusal a problem with their own reasoning. He spent 4 days with the archive. I do not use spent loosely. He was in the intelligence room for 16 hours on the first day. I brought him food because he did not appear to remember to get it himself, and I sat across from him and worked on the diplomatic reports that were still my primary official function while he moved through material that no other person had apparently chosen to read all the way through because it was old and because the conclusion everyone had drawn from it was that the Mothermind was not a problem to be solved but a condition to be managed. The 4th day he covered the walls. Veeler told me about it. She had gone to the intelligence room to return a data reader and found Cadence standing in the middle of the space surrounded by mapped nodes of information that he had printed on physical display sheets and arranged across every available surface. There were lines between them drawn by hand in the precise connecting way of someone who is building a model rather than making notes. There were dates there, were pattern markers, there were questions written in small clear letters at the intersections of lines where the model was incomplete. I went to see it. It was the 400 years he had laid it out. Every major engagement, every probe, every withdrawal, every data point that the archive contained, arranged not chronologically, but by the variable he cared about, how the mother mind had responded, what it had learned, how its behavior had changed. The pattern was visible once you saw what he had organized it around. It was deeply, uncomfortably visible. It has never encountered the same decision twice, he said, when I had stood with it for long enough. Every commander who has engaged it has used doctrine. Keldron doctrine is excellent. I mean this. It is refined, and it is powerful, and it has been the reason the Imperium has held the zone for 4 centuries, but it is consistent. It is predictable in the ways that matter to a learning intelligence. Every time the Keldron engage, the mother mind receives information it can process, and it processes it, and the next engagement is different. That is why the 3 fleet actions failed. I said that is why they failed. He confirmed each one was better prepared than the last based on what they had learned from the previous attempt. But preparation based on previous attempts is still preparation that the mother mind has already accounted for, because it has also been learning from those same attempts. I looked at the walls. What defeats something that learns something it has never seen before? He said, not a new weapon. New weapons are data, not a new formation. Formations are doctrine, and doctrine is predictable, something genuinely outside the model it has built. What is outside its model? I asked. He looked at me. A decision it cannot predict, he said, made by commander who is willing to do something that looks wrong by every established standard at the exact moment that wrong is the right answer. We stood in that room for a long time. The lines on the walls connected and crossed and connected again. Outside the front breathed its slow, costly breath, and somewhere in the deep zone, the mother mind processed the last 400 years of information and waited for the next pattern to arrive. You're going to fight it? I said. It was not a question. I am going to propose it to the senior command. He said. They can say no. They will say yes. I said, because they have been looking for someone to say it is possible for a very long time. He looked at me. Is it possible? I looked at the walls. I looked at the lines in the dates and the patterns and the small, precise questions written at the places where certainty ran out. You made Chiron possible. I said. You made the relay engagement possible. You told Valera what would happen before it happened, and it happened exactly as you said. I looked at him. I have stopped asking whether things are possible for you. I have started asking what the cost will be. His expression shifted in the way it did when something I said reached further than the surface. The cost will be real, he said. I know. I said, tell me what you need from me. He told me. The briefing to the senior command took place the following morning, and it was one of the more remarkable things I have witnessed in my career, not because of what was said, but because of what happened in the room as it was said. The senior staff arrived with the polite resistance of experienced commanders who have held a difficult position for a long time and have developed a settled peace with its difficulty. They left with something different. They did not leave convinced. They left uncertain. Which is the more powerful state? Certainty forecloses questioning. Uncertainty keeps it open. The campaign plan was approved 11 days later. I will not describe the full scope of it here, because the scope with the point, it was not a raid, not a probe, not a demonstration. It was a genuine attempt on the mother mind, built on the premise that the engagement's decisive variable was not force or position, but the quality of surprise. Caden spent those 11 days in preparation that was, even by my standards of sustained effort, extraordinary. He slept in short cycles. He worked with Nora Bain, who had been transferred to the front at his request, on a specific modification to the energy signature of our forward vessels. He worked with Wheeler on information architecture that would allow the command network to relay decisions faster than the standard protocols. He worked with Wheeler on a navigation approach that used the debris field's own gravitational characteristics in a way that the field's three-dimensional complexity had previously made impractical, and that he had found a partial solution for in the oldest section of the archive, written by Keldron navigator who had explored the zone's edge 160 years ago and had noted, almost as an aside, a specific current in the gravity gradient that no one had apparently followed up on. He read that navigator's notes 3 times. I know, because I was in the room each time. On the eve of the campaign, I found him in the observation bay. The same window, the same dark, the same stars. He was standing with his hands at his sides, and he looked for the first time since I had known him like someone who was carrying the full weight of what he was about to do. I stood beside him. Say it, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I know the plan. I believe in the plan. I have built it on the best information available, and I have accounted for every variable I can identify. He paused. There are variables I cannot identify. There always are, and the cost of this one if the variables go wrong. I know, I said. The people in those ships, I know. I said again. He turned to look at me in the observation window behind him. The stars were the stars of the boundary zone, harder and fewer than the stars of the inner systems. He looked at me with the open expression, the one I had been learning to read since the training room, and said, I am glad you are here. I told you I was coming. I said, I know. He said, I wanted to say it anyway. We stood at the window, and I thought about the ceremony and the council chamber and the plain gray uniform and first morning on Kethen, and the coffee on the corner of my desk, and the sparring session and the map with its overlaid patterns, and 11 dead and 23 wounded, and the walls covered in 400 years of lines and questions and connections. I thought about what he had built, not in the 11 days of campaign planning, but in the full sequence of everything that had come before it. Every morning and every session, and every question asked with full attention, and every meal left outside an office door. Cadden, I said. He waited. I did not marry you with any feeling, I said. I married you because I was told to, and I arranged myself around that fact with the efficiency I apply to all political obligations. I want you to know the difference between that and what is true now, because you deserve the distinction, and I have been carrying it for long enough that it is becoming impractical To carry alone, he looked at me for a long time. How long, he asked. I thought about it honestly. The sparring, I said. When you fell and got up. The sixth time, something changed in his face. Not the almost smile, not the weighted look. Something simpler, deeper, the expression of a person who has been patient for a long time and has not stopped hoping. I have been waiting, he said. I know, I said. I saw it. I was not ready. Are you ready now? I looked at the stars. I looked at the dark. I thought about the mother mind out there in the debris field, ancient and patient and learning, and I thought about the campaign plan on the walls of the intelligence room, and I thought about all the variables that could not be identified, and I thought about the sixth time he got up from the mat. Yes, I said. The campaign launched at the 9th hour. I will describe what I witnessed, and I will not pretend to have seen what I did not. My position during the engagement was in the carrier's command center, managing the communication network that Catan had built, which meant I had a full view of the battle's information architecture, even when I could not see the physical engagements. What I saw in that network over the 9 hours that followed was something I do not have a single word for in Keldrin or in Terran Standard. He moved through the engagement the way water moves through complex landscape, not forcing a path, but finding the path that already existed, the one the landscape had made available by being exactly what it was. He had told his commanders before the campaign that the decisive variable was surprise, and he had built his plan on the willingness to do the wrong thing at the right moment. What this meant in practice was a series of decisions that, seen individually, looked like errors and, seen together, formed a shape the mother mind had never encountered. He pulled back when the doctrine said push. He advanced when the doctrine said consolidate. He used a decommissioned relay station that he had been prepositioning for 7 days as a signal mirror to bend a firing solution around the debris field's gravity shadow, which should not have worked and did work, because the navigator from 160 years ago had been right about gravity current, and Catan had been the first person to use that information as a weapon. He hurt the mother mind. He heard it in a way that was visible in the engagement data as a distributed hesitation, a pause across multiple sectors simultaneously, a moment of recalculation from something that had not needed to recalculate in a very long time, and then in the 7th hour, with the carrier's engines running past rated tolerance and 2 of our support vessels pulled back for critical repairs and the mother minds remaining mass converging on our position, he did the thing I had not expected and could not have predicted. He transmitted to it not a weapon, not a jamming signal, a message. He transmitted a message to the VTH Chi mothermind. I saw it go out in the communication log. 11 seconds of transmission. I do not know what it said. He has never told me. I have not asked, because there are things between a person and the thing they faced at the edge of the possible that belong to that space alone, and I respect what belongs to other spaces. The mother mind paused. 11 seconds of complete distributed cross-sector pause. Every Vekai element in every sector of the engagement stopped. 11 seconds in which every sensor in the engagement network registered stillness where there had been continuous pressure. Then the mother mind fractured, not collapsed. Fractured, distributed coherence, breaking into non-coordinated segments. The central processing decoupling from the local nodes, the intelligence that had managed 400 years of continuous adaptation experiencing seeing something it had not been built to account for. Our fleet moved through the fractured segments in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The battle was over. Cadence sat back in his command chair and closed his eyes, 30 seconds by my count. Then he opened them and began directing the search and rescue operations for damaged vessels. He did not announce the victory. He did not raise his voice. He simply moved in the quiet and focused way he always moved to the next thing that needed doing. Grief found me in the carrier corridor after the engagement. He had been part of the internal security detail, and Zimmer showed the signs of a hard 9 hours. He looked at me with the expression of a man recalculating something fundamental. Vorathrath, he said, not to me, to the air between us, as if he was testing the weight of the syllables. Yes, I said. It fits, he said, and walked on. It did fit. It fit the way a name fits when it is found rather than assigned. The carriers and the support vessels made for the deep zone station 3 days after the engagement, and on those 3 days I noticed a thing that I had observed before, but that was different now, in the way things are different when you are looking at them with new eyes. Every person who passed Cadden in a corridor, Kelran officers, tearing crew, the various attached personnel from 5 different species who made up the working population of a frontline carrier, every one of them acknowledged him, not with the formal acknowledgments of rank, with the other kind, the shorter, more personal kind that people use for someone they have decided to trust. He acknowledged every one of them back without exception, without hierarchy. The same attention, the same recognition offered to the carrier's most junior technician as to Valera or Colonel Vane. On the second day, I told him about the second name. He already knew Avorth. He had not yet heard the complete version of what was being said in the networks. They are not using one name now, I said. They are using both together. Yoriketh Yoreth. I paused. There is a third phrase being added. He looked at me. Velkeith Terran. I said, it is old Keldrin. It means the human who is Keldrin. It has stopped. It is a thing that has never been said before, not in 600 years. He was quiet for a long time. I don't want to replace what your people are, he said. I want to stand beside it. I know, I said. That is why they are saying it. He looked out the window at the stars, which were growing warmer and more numerous as we moved away from the zone's edge and back toward the inner stations. The boundary zone was behind us with its debris fields and its careful dark, and the place in the middle of it where something ancient had paused for 11 seconds and then stopped. What happens now, he asked. The High Command issues a commendation, I said. The engagement goes into the archive. A new generation of Kellan officers reads it and uses it as a case study for the next 100 years. And us, he said. I thought about the ceremony and the council chamber and the plain gray uniform, and every morning and every evening, and the full length of what had grown in the space between a political arrangement and this corridor, on this carrier with the stars outside, the window brightening as we move toward home. We are a different question, I said, one I do not have a clean answer for yet. I can wait, he said. I know, I said. You have always been able to wait. It is one of the more inconvenient things about you. He smiled, not the almost smile, the one rare and complete, the smile of a person who is genuinely uncomplicated, happy in a specific moment. I had seen it only a few times, and each time it did something to the architecture of my composure that I was not going to examine closely in a ship corridor. I have been called worse, he said. It was the same thing he had said to my aunt in the council chamber on the first day in response to being told what he was and was not. It landed differently now. It had always been funny in the dry, precise way of a person who has found peace with their own position. Now it was also something else, a small full circle thing, a thread pulled back from the beginning and held up in the light. I said nothing. I did not need to. We both understood that we were somewhere entirely different from where we had started, and that we had gotten there by a route that neither of us had planned or predicted, and that the route itself, every fall and every getting up, every map and every morning run, every battle, and every name given by soldiers who where there was the real story. We were still writing it. That is the thing about stories that matter. They do not have a clean ending. They have a point where you look up and realize how far you have come from the first page, and the distance surprises you, and the surprise is the point. The station at Chiron was 11 days behind us. The inner systems were 12 days ahead. The stars outside the window were thick and warm, and full of the light of places we had not yet been. Caden stood beside me at the window, and I stood beside him, and neither of us needed to say anything further. Some things do not require words. They require time and presence, and the particular kind of patience that builds something real out of nothing. It was expected to become. He had always known how to be patient. I had been learning in his company how to let myself need what I needed and say what was true without managing the distance between the saying and the feeling. I was not finished learning. He was not finished building. The VTHK front still breathed in the dark behind us, changed but not silent, adapted but not ended, and the human who the void did not break stood at a window on a carrier, moving toward morning, and the stars burned all around us, and the story continued. It always continues. That is, I have come to understand precisely the